The Festival of Eternal Bonds transformed the capital city of Valephera into a spectacular display of telepathic artistry, where streams of colored light danced through the air as participants demonstrated their psychic abilities to potential partners. Dr. Michael Torres stood at the edge of the central plaza, his recording equipment capturing every detail of the ancient courtship ritual that would determine marriages and political alliances for the coming year. The strength of the telepathic bond between partners determines not just personal compatibility but social status and family advancement for generations, explained his cultural liaison, Kentvar Theshai, a mid-level government official whose own powerful psychic abilities had secured him an advantageous marriage the previous year. Those with weaker abilities often remain unselected, which carries significant social and economic consequences. Michael nodded, making notes on his tablet while observing the elaborate displays around them. Valephera participants floated objects through complex patterns, shared vivid mental images with observers, and created synchronized telepathic performances that resembled three-dimensional art forms painted with pure thought. At the center of the plaza, the most gifted telepaths commanded audiences of potential partners and their families, their demonstrations creating cascading auroras that made the air itself seem alive with possibility. These were the individuals who would form the political and social elite of Valephera society, their union strengthening bloodlines and consolidating power in ways that would affect their civilization for centuries. But it was a figure at the periphery of the festivities who caught Michael's attention, a young woman who participated in the displays with quiet dignity despite receiving only polite acknowledgement from those evaluating potential partners. "Who is that?" Michael asked, gesturing toward the woman whose telepathic demonstrations were competent but clearly less powerful than those of the central performers. Kentvar followed his gaze and seemed surprised by the question. "That is Lyranet Keshar of House Minor Keshar. She participates each year according to tradition, but her telepathic abilities are insufficient for advantageous bonding." Michael watched as Lyranet created delicate patterns of light that, while less spectacular than the major displays, showed remarkable artistic sensitivity and emotional depth. Her demonstrations focused on subtle beauty rather than raw power, creating intimate experiences that spoke to aesthetic appreciation rather than psychic dominance. "Insufficient how?" Michael asked, genuinely curious about the criteria that seemed to dismiss obvious talent. "Her telepathic range is limited to basic communication and simple object manipulation," Kentvar explained matter-of-factly. "She cannot project complex shared experiences, lacks the psychic strength for deep mental bonding, and her abilities would likely produce offspring with similarly weak talents." The clinical dismissal of someone whose artistic abilities clearly exceeded many of the superior candidates struck Michael as fundamentally unjust. "But her work is beautiful. That display she just created showed remarkable creativity and emotional intelligence." "Beauty without power is merely decoration," Kentvar replied, unconsciously echoing what was apparently a common cultural attitude. "Successful partnerships require telepathic compatibility that can strengthen family lines and maintain social position." As the day progressed, Michael watched the systematic process by which potential partners evaluated and selected each other. The most powerful telepaths formed alliances almost immediately, their unions celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that involved entire family networks. Mid-level participants engaged in complex negotiations that balanced psychic ability with political connections and economic advantages. And throughout it all, Lyranet continued her quiet participation, presenting herself according to traditional protocols while receiving responses that ranged from polite disinterest to barely concealed dismissal. Michael observed at least a dozen interactions where potential partners evaluated her abilities, acknowledged her artistic skills with diplomatic courtesy, and moved on to more suitable candidates. Dr. Torres, Lyranet approached him during a break in the formal presentations, her manner respectful but not subservient. "I understand you are studying our cultural practices. Are there aspects of the festival that require clarification?" Michael found himself impressed by her direct communication style and obvious intelligence. "I'm particularly interested in how partnerships are formed and what criteria determine compatibility." "Psychic strength above all else," Lyranet replied with a slight smile that didn't quite hide the resignation in her voice. The ability to share thoughts, emotions, and experiences through direct mental connection. The stronger the connection, the more successful the partnership is considered to be. And artistic ability? Emotional intelligence? Personal compatibility? Michael asked. Secondary considerations, Lyronette said diplomatically. Important for daily harmony, but not sufficient foundation for bonding that will determine family advancement and social position. Michael spent the remainder of the day observing interactions that confirmed Lyronette's assessment. The festival operated according to rigid hierarchies where psychic strength determined worth, artistic accomplishment was dismissed as pleasant but irrelevant, and personal chemistry was subordinated to genetic and social calculations. By evening, when the day's successful pairings were announced, Lyronette stood alone among the remaining participants. Her isolation was made more poignant by her gracious congratulations to those who had been selected, maintaining dignity despite another day of systematic rejection. "Tomorrow will bring new opportunities," she said to Michael as the formal ceremonies concluded. The festival continues for 3 days, allowing multiple chances for compatible partnerships to form. But Michael could see in her expression that she held little hope for different outcomes. In a society that valued only psychic power, someone whose greatest strengths lay in areas that couldn't be measured through telepathic demonstration would always be considered inadequate, regardless of their actual worth as a partner or person. As he prepared his research notes that evening, Michael found himself questioning not just Valefaery cultural practices but his own role as an observer of what was beginning to feel like systematic cruelty disguised as tradition. The second day of the Festival of Eternal Bonds intensified the competition as remaining participants sought to form partnerships before the most desirable candidates were claimed. Michael arrived at the plaza early, hoping to document the evolving dynamics as social pressures mounted and choices became more limited. "The urgency increases significantly today," Kentvar explained as they positioned themselves for optimal observation. "Those who remain unselected after today face much reduced options tomorrow, and the social implications of being unchosen grow more severe with each passing day." Michael watched as Lyronette prepared for another round of presentations, her careful attention to detail suggesting someone who understood that today might represent her best opportunity for partnership. She had arranged her artistic displays with even greater care than the previous day, creating telepathic sculptures that showcased her unique aesthetic sensibilities. "Lyronette," Michael approached her during the pre-ceremony preparations, "would you be willing to explain some of the traditional elements of the festival? My academic background covers the basic structure, but I'm missing cultural nuances that might help me understand the deeper significance." Her surprise at being addressed directly by an off-world observer was obvious, but she responded with the kind of thoughtful intelligence that Michael had begun to appreciate. "Of course, Dr. Torres. What aspects would be most helpful for your research?" As they walked through the ceremonial grounds, Lyronette provided insights that no academic source had captured. She explained how telepathic displays weren't just demonstrations of power but communications about personality, values, and life philosophy. Her own presentations, she revealed, were designed to convey emotional depth, artistic vision, and capacity for intimate connection rather than raw psychic strength. "Most of my competitors focus on impressive displays that showcase their maximum capabilities," she explained, gesturing toward a particularly spectacular levitation performance. "I try to create experiences that reveal who I am as a person, hoping someone will value depth over power." "And has that approach been successful?" Michael asked, though her continued single status suggested the answer. Lyronette's smile was rueful. "It has attracted interest from individuals who appreciate artistic expression, but not from those seeking partnerships that will advance their social position. Unfortunately, most participants fall into the latter category." Their conversation was interrupted by the formal commencement of the day's presentations. Michael found himself positioned where he could observe both the main festivities and Lyronette's interactions with potential partners, giving him a comprehensive view of how social hierarchies played out in personal relationships. The pattern from the previous day repeated itself with discouraging consistency. Potential partners approached Lyronette with polite interest, evaluated her telepathic abilities through traditional testing protocols, acknowledged her artistic accomplishments with diplomatic courtesy, and moved on to candidates whose psychic strength promised greater genetic and social advantages. Her displays are quite lovely. Michael overheard one potential partner explain to his family advisors, but the telepathic connection is too weak for serious consideration. Our bloodline requires stronger psychic traits for advancement within the council hierarchy. Another suitor spent considerable time appreciating Lyranette's artistic creations before ultimately deciding that aesthetic compatibility cannot compensate for insufficient telepathic bonding potential in partnerships that must serve family and social advancement. Michael found these conversations increasingly disturbing as he realized that individuals with obvious intelligence and sensitivity were being reduced to genetic commodities rather than evaluated as complete people. The festival's focus on measurable psychic abilities eliminated consideration of qualities that actually determined relationship success: empathy, humor, shared interests, and emotional compatibility. Dr. Torres, Lyranette joined him during the midday break. May I ask about partnership traditions in human society? Do your people emphasize particular abilities or characteristics when forming romantic bonds? The question gave Michael an opportunity to explain concepts that seemed completely foreign to Veilfairy culture: relationships based on mutual attraction, shared values, emotional connection, and personal choice rather than genetic optimization and social advancement. We do consider compatibility, Michael explained, but it's usually about whether people enjoy each other's company, share similar goals and values, and feel genuine affection for each other. Physical attraction matters, but so does intellectual connection, humor, kindness, and dozens of other factors that can't be measured through testing. Lyranette listened with obvious fascination. Your partnerships are based on individual preference rather than family strategy? Mostly, yes. Some cultures emphasize arranged marriages or social compatibility, but the general principle is that people should choose partners they genuinely want to spend their lives with, regardless of what advantages those partnerships might bring to their families. That sounds wonderful, Lyranette said quietly. To be valued for who you are rather than what genetic contributions you might make to someone else's advancement. The afternoon presentations proved even more challenging for Lyranette as the remaining pool of participants became increasingly focused on securing any partnership rather than holding out for ideal matches. Several potential partners approached her with what amounted to desperation rather than genuine interest, viewing her as a backup option when their preferred choices rejected them. Lyranette Keshar, one particularly pragmatic suitor, announced, "Your telepathic abilities, while limited, would be sufficient for basic household partnership. My family is prepared to offer bonding terms that acknowledge your artistic accomplishments while recognizing the genetic limitations of any offspring." The clinical nature of the proposal, treating her as acceptable merchandise rather than a person someone might actually want to marry, made Michael physically uncomfortable. But Lyranette declined with the same grace she had shown throughout the festival, maintaining her dignity despite being treated as a consolation prize. As the second day concluded with another round of successful pairings that didn't include her, Michael realized he was witnessing something that went beyond cultural differences. The systematic devaluation of someone with obvious worth simply because she didn't meet arbitrary criteria for psychic strength represented a form of institutionalized cruelty that his academic objectivity couldn't ignore. Tomorrow is the final day, Lyranette said as the evening ceremonies wound down. Traditionally, it offers last opportunities for partnerships before the festival concludes. But her tone suggested someone preparing for disappointment rather than hoping for success. After 2 days of systematic rejection, she seemed to be accepting that her society had no place for someone whose greatest strengths couldn't be measured through telepathic testing. Michael returned to his quarters that evening with research notes that documented more than just cultural practices. He had recorded evidence of how rigid social hierarchies could blind civilizations to the actual worth of their citizens, creating systems that discarded valuable individuals simply because they didn't fit predetermined molds for success. The final day of the Festival of Eternal Bonds carried an atmosphere of desperate urgency as remaining participants faced their last opportunity to avoid the social stigma of being unchosen. Michael arrived at the plaza to find families engaged in increasingly frantic negotiations, willing to accept partnerships they would have rejected days earlier rather than face another year of waiting. Today sees the most pragmatic arrangements, Kentvar explained with obvious discomfort. Individuals who remain unselected by this evening will carry significant social disadvantages until the next festival. Michael observed the mounting pressure with growing unease, watching as people who had held out for ideal matches began settling for whoever would accept them. The celebration that had begun with displays of beauty and talent was ending with desperate bargaining and resigned acceptance of inadequate partnerships. Lyronette's family had arrived early, her parents engaging in quiet conversations with other families that suggested they were exploring alternative arrangements for their daughter's future. Michael caught fragments of discussions about auxiliary partnerships, shared household arrangements, and other options that would provide social cover for someone who might remain permanently unselected. Perhaps it would be better to accept Vorthclan Keshai's offer, he overheard her mother saying. A secondary bonding arrangement would at least provide social position and economic security, even if it lacks the honor of primary partnership. Lyronette herself seemed to have accepted her likely fate with remarkable grace, participating in the day's presentations with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the festival. But Michael could see the strain in her posture, the way she held herself slightly apart from the increasingly frenzied negotiations around her. Dar. Torres, she approached him during the morning preparations. I wanted to thank you for your interest in our cultural practices. Your questions have helped me see our traditions from new perspectives. Lyronette, Michael said carefully, have you considered that perhaps the problem isn't with you but with a system that evaluates people based on such limited criteria? Her smile was sad but not bitter. I have wondered about that, especially after our conversations about human partnership traditions. But questioning cultural foundations is a luxury for those with sufficient social position to afford unconventional thinking. The day's presentations took on a markedly different character as participants abandoned artistic expression in favor of desperate practical demonstrations. Potential partners evaluated each other with the kind of calculating desperation that reduced romance to economic transaction and genetic compatibility to breeding calculations. Michael watched several interactions where Lyronette was approached by individuals who were clearly settling for whatever partnership they could arrange. One particularly unpleasant suitor informed her that, while your telepathic limitations are regrettable, your artistic abilities would provide adequate household entertainment, and your family's modest status would not significantly damage my social position. Another potential partner offered what he described as a charitable bonding, that would provide you with social protection while acknowledging the genetic sacrifices my family would be making in accepting your limited psychic heritage. Each interaction made Michael angrier at a system that treated someone of obvious worth as damaged goods to be accepted reluctantly rather than chosen enthusiastically. But Lyronette continued to decline proposals that treated her as a burden to be borne rather than a partner to be cherished. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd in the plaza began to thin as successful partnerships were formalized and new couples departed for private celebrations. The remaining participants grew increasingly desperate, engaging in negotiations that bore no resemblance to the romantic ideals the festival supposedly celebrated. Lyronette, her father approached with obvious reluctance. Elder Vorthclan has indicated that his offer of auxiliary partnership remains available. While it lacks the honor of primary bonding, it would provide social position and economic security. Michael watched the conversation with growing frustration, understanding that Lyronette was being pressured to accept a role as essentially a secondary wife to an already bonded couple, providing domestic and artistic services in exchange for social protection. I understand the practical advantages, Lyronette replied quietly, but I would prefer to remain unselected rather than accept partnership with someone who views me as a charitable obligation. Her father's expression showed the conflict between respect for his daughter's dignity and concern for her social future. The consequences of remaining unchosen are mine to bear, Lyronette said firmly. I will not accept partnership based on pity or convenience. As the final formal presentations began, Michael realized he was watching the systematic conclusion of a process that had evaluated and discarded someone whose actual qualities, intelligence, creativity, emotional depth, moral courage, made her more worthy of partnership than many of those who had been eagerly chosen. The climactic moment arrived when the festival's final successful partnerships were announced, leaving only a handful of individuals who had failed to secure bonding arrangements. Lyranette stood among them, but her isolation was unique. While the others seemed defeated by their rejection, she maintained a dignity that spoke of someone who refused to accept society's valuation of her worth. Then, in a moment that shattered every protocol Michael had observed during 3 days of careful cultural documentation, Lyranette did something unprecedented. Instead of accepting dismissal with resigned grace, she turned away from the traditional closing ceremonies and walked directly toward where he stood observing from the plaza's edge. The conversations around them gradually died as other participants noticed her movement toward the human observer. By the time she reached him, the entire remaining crowd had fallen silent, uncertain what they were witnessing but understanding that something unprecedented was occurring. "Dar. Michael Torres," Lyranette said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "you have shown me that partnerships can be based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection rather than genetic advantages and social calculations." Michael felt his heart begin to race as he realized what was happening. Lyranette was abandoning all pretense of following traditional protocols, risking social catastrophe for a chance at something that no Veilfairy had ever attempted. "You have valued my thoughts, appreciated my perspectives, and treated me as an equal rather than as someone to be evaluated for genetic utility," she continued, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "You have shown me what it means to be chosen for who I am rather than what I might contribute to someone else's advancement." The silence around them was absolute, hundreds of witnesses frozen in shock at behavior that violated every cultural norm they understood. "Will you marry me?" Lyranette asked, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible throughout the plaza. Michael stared at her, understanding that his response would determine not just her future but would establish precedents for interspecies relationships that neither civilization had previously contemplated. Everything about the situation defied protocol, challenged cultural assumptions, and risked diplomatic complications that could affect relations between their peoples for generations. But looking at Lyranette, seeing the courage it had taken to abandon traditional safety for the possibility of genuine partnership, recognizing the worth that her own society had systematically overlooked, Michael realized that his decision had already been made. The silence following Lyranette's proposal stretched across the plaza like a physical force, hundreds of witnesses frozen in disbelief at what they had just heard. Michael looked into her eyes and saw not desperation but courage, the strength of someone willing to risk everything for the possibility of genuine connection. "Yes," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute quiet. "Yes, I will marry you." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Veilfairy observers gasped with shock and outrage, family members stared in horror at the unprecedented breach of cultural protocols, and festival officials struggled to comprehend how to handle a situation their traditions had never anticipated. "This is impossible!" Kentvar exclaimed, pushing through the crowd toward them. "Interspecies bonding is not recognized under Veilfairy law. The cultural implications are exactly what they should be," Michael interrupted, taking Lyranette's trembling hand in his. "Someone of extraordinary worth has been systematically devalued by a system that measures only the most superficial qualities while ignoring everything that actually matters for successful partnerships." Elder Vorth Clan Keshai, the festival's senior coordinator, approached with obvious distress. "Dr. Torres, surely you cannot be serious. The legal complications alone can be resolved by people who choose cooperation over rigid adherence to precedent," Michael replied firmly. "The question is whether your society is willing to acknowledge that worth can't be measured through telepathic testing, and that the most important qualities for partnership are character, compatibility, and mutual respect." Lyranette's parents reached them moments later, her mother pale with shock and her father struggling to process the implications of their daughter's unprecedented choice. "Lyranette," her mother whispered, "what have you done? The social consequences will be far less severe than spending my life in a partnership based on pity or convenience," Lyranette replied, her voice gaining strength as she realized that Michael's acceptance had transformed her situation completely. Dr. Torres has shown me what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what genetic contributions I might make to someone else's advancement. The crowd around them had grown as word of the extraordinary proposal spread throughout the festival grounds. Representatives from both the Human Diplomatic Mission and Vale government began arriving, clearly struggling to develop responses to a situation their protocols had never addressed. Dr. Torres, Ambassador Chen from the human delegation approached with barely concealed panic. I need to remind you that your research mission doesn't include authority to create interspecies marriage agreements. The diplomatic implications are secondary to the human implications, Michael replied. Which include treating people with dignity regardless of their species, recognizing worth that goes beyond measurable abilities, and having the courage to stand for principles that matter more than political convenience. Elder Thesvar of the Vale Ferry Cultural Council stepped forward, his expression grave. This situation has no precedent in our recorded history. Interspecies bonding raises questions of law, tradition, and social structure that would require extensive consultation to resolve. Then consult, Michael said simply. But understand that you're not just deciding legal technicalities. You're determining whether your civilization is mature enough to recognize that true partnership is built on mutual respect and emotional connection rather than genetic calculations and social hierarchies. What followed were 3 hours of intense negotiations between human and Vale Ferry representatives, complicated by the fact that neither species had legal frameworks for handling interspecies marriage or the cultural precedents it would establish. But throughout the debates, Michael and Lyronette remained together, their presence serving as a living challenge to assumptions both civilizations had never questioned. Michael, Lyronette said quietly during a break in the official discussions, are you certain about this decision? Your acceptance changes everything about both our futures in ways we can't fully predict. Michael looked at the woman whose courage had shattered cultural barriers to ask for what she deserved, partnership based on choice rather than calculation, respect rather than resignation, hope rather than mere social survival. Lyronette, 3 days ago I thought I was here to document cultural practices as an objective observer. Instead, I discovered someone whose intelligence, creativity, and moral courage made her more worthy of partnership than anyone else in that plaza. The fact that your society couldn't see that says more about their limitations than yours. The resolution came when Elder Kesterin, the most senior member of the Vale Ferry Council, announced that their ancient bonding laws contained provisions for exceptional circumstances that serve the greater cultural development of our people. Michael and Lyronette's union would be recognized as a diplomatic and cultural exchange that could benefit both civilizations. But the legal recognition was secondary to the personal transformation that had already occurred. In choosing to ask for what she wanted rather than accepting what she was offered, Lyronette had discovered that her worth wasn't determined by others' ability to recognize it. In accepting her proposal, Michael had found a partnership built on genuine compatibility rather than superficial attraction or political advantage. You know, Lyronette said 6 months later as they reviewed the success of their joint cultural exchange program, when I asked you to marry me, I thought I was making a desperate gamble to avoid social rejection. Michael smiled, looking at the woman who had become not just his wife but his partner in developing new models for interspecies cooperation that emphasized shared values over genetic or social calculations. What do you think now? He asked. I think I was making the first real choice of my adult life, she replied. Choosing someone who saw my worth rather than my limitations, who valued my contributions rather than measuring my deficiencies. Their marriage had indeed transformed both their lives and their societies. The success of their partnership had inspired other, weak, telepaths to question whether social rejection was inevitable, while human observers learned that the most meaningful connections often formed between individuals who complemented each other's strengths rather than duplicating the same advantages. The Council approved the new partnership protocols, Lyronette announced, reading through the day's communications. They're establishing cultural exchange programs that evaluate compatibility based on shared interests, emotional connection, and mutual respect rather than psychic strength alone. Michael felt deep satisfaction at the news. Their union had proven that the most important choice in partnership wasn't following cultural expectations but having the courage to ask for what you truly wanted and needed. Lyronette, he said as they prepared for another day of building bridges between civilizations, "I need you to know that when you asked me to marry you, you didn't just change your own life. You taught me that the most profound connections are forged when someone is brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of genuine partnership." She smiled with the confidence that had grown as she discovered her own worth beyond her society's narrow definitions. "And you taught me that being chosen for who you really are is worth any risk, any challenge, any departure from conventional expectations." Their story became legend in both civilizations. Proof that sometimes the most important questions were the ones that seemed impossible to ask, that genuine partnership required the courage to seek what you deserved rather than accepting what you were offered, and that the most meaningful relationships began not with perfect compatibility but with someone brave enough to ask for love and someone wise enough to recognize it when it was offered.